This is Trish Thomas-Mink, and welcome to another story. This one is about the Glastenbury Mountain. It's part of the Green Mountains range in Vermont. It is home to some really spine-chilling legends, everything from the man-eating rock to the unexplained Bennington Triangle. The northeast side of the mountain drains into the Long Island Sound, and the southeast side of the mountain drains into the Hudson River. It is right off the Appalachian Trail, and the locals warn visitors to be survival ready and not to get lost, or you may not be seen again. The woods are filled with lakes, swamps, blowdowns, and thickets. The first part of the story is about the original ghost town, Glastonbury, Vermont. It was chartered in 1761, and by 1937 it was unincorporated by Vermont due to the small population. The town's boom era was right after the Civil War, and the community had a charcoal making industry and a logging railroad. The town boasted a post office, small houses, a school, and its population peaked at about 241 souls in 1880. There were several other small communities that don't exist any longer either that had affiliations or were nearby. Fayetteville and Somerset, Vermont are two of those. The town of Glastonbury began to fail when the area experienced two murders. The first one was John Crowley. He was 38. He was murdered in Fayetteville in April of 1892. A man named Henry McDowell, who also went by Henry Conroy, hit Crowley in the head with either a piece of wood or a rock. Now, John didn't immediately die, but he kind of lingered on for a few days. So while he was alive, McDowell hung around the area. When Crowley died, McDowell took off. He set off riding the rails into Canada, and he came back into the U.S. down to South Norwalk in Connecticut. He was arrested there, and he was tried and sentenced to Waterbury State Mental Hospital for Crowley's murder. While he was there, one of his jobs was that he worked on the grounds, and after an undetermined amount of time, McDowell hid in a bin, escaped, and was never seen again. Now, the area was already seen as mysterious and remote even at this point. And John Harbour participated in the first hunting season ever in Vermont, October 1897. He was shot to death on October 1st, and no one ever came forward. His widow went to her graves decade later without ever knowing who killed her husband. These stories are just some of the few that add to the eerie vibes of the area. After a time, the trees they harvested were clear-cut, so the area had lost all of its trees. And they used the trees, and what do you do when you burn them down? They turn on to charcoal. And charcoal was a main source of heating at that time. So they basically had to reinvent themselves because logging was no more a viable source of income for the area. So what they did is they refurbished the tracks, and they had this train that traveled like 9 miles around the area. And they refurbished the tracks and replaced the train with a trolley that went the same 9 miles. Glastonbury turned the old loggers' boarding house into a hotel and the apartment building with a general store into a casino. And in 1897, the community was a summer resort with a trolley, a hotel, and a casino. The resort only had one season. The area had been clear-cut so much that the soil was decimated. It had nothing holding it together. The winter of 1898 saw horrific flooding, which washed out the tracks for the trolley, and the resort was permanently shut down. By 1936, there were 3 residents, and the town was unincorporated, as I said, by the state of Vermont the following year. They also called this area the Bennington Triangle, and every paranormal trait has been attributed to the region. UFO phenomenon, Bigfoot, and unexplained disappearances, just to name a few. Next, the second part of this vlog is going to be about those disappearances. There were 5 people that disappeared from the area during the mid-20th century. And the first one was a man, a woodsman, hunter, by the name of Mitty Rivers. He was a guide, and he was taking out 4 hunters out on a trip. And this was November 1945. And the experienced woodman led the group of hunters out. And about 4 p.m., they were headed back to camp, walking through Hill Hollow near Bickford Hollow Road. Mitty pulled just ahead of the hunters, and at that point he was never seen again. Now, the hunters were not concerned at first because they thought he would hook back up with them at camp. Within days of the disappearance, the U.S. Army Corps, and they reported him missing November 12th, 1945. So within days, the U.S. Army Corps came to help find him, and people were offered $4 a day to search for the experienced woodsman. At this point, too, Vermont did not have a state police department. Now, the hunters were, like I said, not concerned at first because he was an experienced woodsman. He never was seen again, and only a bit of evidence was a single shell from a hunting rifle. How did this experienced hunter woodsman disappear without a trace? December of 1946, Bennington College sophomore 18-year-old Paula Weldon was hiking along Route 9 on Reservoir Road, and she just simply vanished. Paula had finished her shift at the college cafeteria and was in what her roommate called a funk. So she put on pants and her red parka and headed out for a walk about 4 p.m., December 1st, 1946. An older couple had spotted the young woman walking along the road, and because they saw her red parka. This time of year, the daylight was fading into dusk about this time. The couple said they rounded a bend in the road and she was simply gone, vanished. Paula's father was a well-known industrialist from Connecticut. Now, I had difficulty finding his name. Even in the old newspapers, they referred to him as a well-known industrialist. He brought in helicopters to search for Paula, and it was that lack of resources from this case that subsequently created the Vermont State Police. Paula's father was said to search for her the rest of his life. An interesting side note that I saw in the December 12th edition of the Rutland Daily Herald is another woman, 21-year-old Louise Ann Moore of Northampton, Massachusetts, was reported being attacked by 2 men. Now, the officials at the time thought there was no connection. Still, it's got to make you wonder. There were various rumors about what happened to Miss Weldon also, and they were never proved. In fact, most were entirely dismissed by the police, but they were rumors. Like she was seen on a Canada-bound bus, that she ran away with a lover that her roommate said she didn't have, or that her parents had something to do with her disappearance. Like I said, none of these rumors ever were validated. An interesting another side note is March 8, 1948, the lower half of a woman's torso was found in the Connecticut River near East Hartford. The article in the North Adams Transcript newspaper revealed authorities could not determine whether the torso belonged to Paula Weldon, but the size, the weight, and her skin tone most resembled her than any other missing woman at that time. The next missing person is James Edward Tedford. He was a veteran of World War II. He was 56 and had married a much younger 28-year-old woman named Pearl. In 1945, he was coming home from a second stint in the military to Franklin, Vermont. It was after the war, and upon arriving, he discovered that his wife had upped and vanished, abandoning their rental property. She was last seen headed for the Amco station to buy a few things, but no one had seen Pearl since. By 1947, Tedford had checked himself into the VA Soldiers' Home, and in 1949 he went on a trip to visit family, boarding a bus in St. Albans. He never made it to his destination, and he was reported missing December 1st, 1949, exactly 3 years to the day after Paula Weldon disappeared. He was seen by at least 14 different people getting on the bus at St. Albans, but by the time the bus stopped at Bennington, Tedford was nowhere to be found, though his belongings and his luggage were still on the bus. The next is Paul Jepson, who was 8 years old. It was October 12th, 1950, when he and his mother took their truck to the dump so she could feed the pigs and move them to a different section of the property. Now, Mrs. Jepson and her husband were part-time caregivers at the dump. She told Paul to stay in the truck while she worked. Now, this is her relating information, of course. He either got out of the truck or was taken out of the truck between 3 and 4 p.m. Bloodhounds were brought in to track Paul. They followed his scent down at least 2 miles to East and Chapel Roads. There were a pair of men's gloves found on the rocks near where the trail ended Paul's scent. Coincidence? We don't know. It was on the way to Glastenbury Mountain. That was the trajectory he took, a place his father stated that Paul had wanted to visit. That night it was pouring down rain, and young Paul was not prepared for the weather. He was wearing his blue pants and a red sweater. A newspaper I read stated the boy had runaway streaks. Paul did not go to school because of nervous defects. He had one sister who was in the 2nd grade, and his parents were former school teachers. More than 100 people searched for Paul, from the Boy Scouts, firefighters, state police, and volunteers. He was never seen again. There was a theory at the time that either the pigs just ate the boy or the parents killed him and fed him to the pigs. There's no evidence of that, but because the papers were alluding to these stories, Paul's father stopped speaking to them. Both Paul and Paula were wearing red when they disappeared, which is why people say to this day not to wear red when you go to Glastonbury Mountain. There's one more woman who went missing from the area. Her name was Frida Langer. She is the only person who went missing during this period where they eventually located her body. Frida was 53. She and her husband were on a vacation with a cousin named Herb. She went on a hike with her cousin about 3 p.m. while he was hunting a partridge or something. Now, Herb Elsner was her cousin. He said he'd hopped across a small brook when he looked around behind him back at Frida, and she had tripped and was sitting in the brook laughing. But she was cold. Her trousers were soaked, so she decided to go back to camp and change. Herb said he left her about 150 yards from their camp, and Frida vanished before she got to the campgrounds. Many don't include her story, as they were near the Somerset Reservoir. A state trooper revealed that he heard 3 gunshots about 11 o'clock that night, though they considered them too far off to count, really. The case became more a mystery as Frida and her husband often went hiking and camping in these woods. She was a strong woman and not afraid of anything. So how did she get so completely lost in an hour before dark? In May 1951, 2 fishermen found the body of Frida Langer down a steep embankment and in a deep water hole in the Deerfield River. She fell down that first evening as it was dark. It was dark and it was also rainy. Her case was different as it wasn't near Bennington, and they eventually recovered her body, so some people don't include that as part of the disappearances. The rest of the missing persons have never been found. I read a comment on one of the sites I visited, and it said that the old-timers in the area warned off a couple of young women who wanted to hike on Glastonbury Mountain. The woman told the old-timers, "It's okay, we've got a gun," to which the old-timers said, "It won't matter." After a second set of locals said the same thing, the women abandoned the idea of going to the mountain. That is probably good judgment. Thank you for checking me out. And please, if you'd like to subscribe, hit the smash button and hit the little bell for notifications, and have a great week.